I am personally thrilled that, for the topic of today's call. I've been in recovery for 33 years, and recovery coaching is something new that has come along. And a very good friend of mine uh, engaged a recovery coach last year, and I got to learn more about it. So, Shane, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I think I first want to start with you sharing a little bit about how you got into recovery coaching and what your experience is like with it, and what are your biggest rewards and challenges.
Okay.
That was like 3 questions, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, give me a chance to rattle off a little bit. Let me start by saying, Harry, thank you for sharing your recovery with us. When you mentioned that, it gave me chills. So that's beautiful. I got into recovery coaching. Seems like I learned about it in my own recovery, talking to people in the rooms who were doing that. It seems like people in recovery seem to be drawn to the humanities, drawn to helping people. That is the 12th step, is paying it forward, sharing what we have. So it seemed like a natural area for me to go to. In New York, there are a lot of programs to get people to become recovery coaches, including scholarships and tons of classes and conventions and conferences. A lot of resources, a lot of money, government money is going into recovery coaching. So it was an easy process for me. Now I have life coaching training before that, so it's been a matter of building on top of that training and seeing some of the similarities and some of the differences. In terms of, let's see, the most rewarding thing is seeing the progress in people's faces. So seeing the light come back on, addiction can be a very dark place. So whenever you start seeing the light, seeing some kind of hope in their eyes, it fills me with so much energy to keep moving and to pay it forward. In that same vein, I would say the challenge is also the struggle of getting sober and walking with clients as they deal with that, and really, also seeing the relapse. It is a relapse disease, so it's very common to see that. It's hard to not take it personal in a way. I do find myself wanting to, or that being my natural place to go. So it's moderating that and managing how we handle relapse and keeping positive about the opportunity.
How important has self-care become to you and doing this work?
It's at the center of my practice. I have to take time for myself. It can be very draining emotionally, spiritually. So I have to go back to the well and fill back up. That way I can continue to shoot.
Yeah. I had, when in a residential program I was working at, one of my directors who was in recovery said this analogy that like always stuck with me. It's like, we're walking around, and I think this applies as coaches too, like we're like lint rollers. So we just accumulate everyone's crap all day long. And so if we don't clean the lint roller off, it doesn't work, right? So you can't like use a dirty lint roller. So I think that's really important to remember, I think, in what we do, and especially with what recovery work is very draining, because you're dealing with relapses and sometimes death.
Yeah.
So it does happen.
That's a good point. Don't take a shirt from someone who's not wearing one.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Good. So I guess it would be a good time to go into your presentation.
Let me pull that up.
Okay.
So I cover a lot of information on here, both for someone just starting out in recovery coaching as a source for that information, and also for people like my audience today, which is, to see the differences and similarities between life coaching and recovery coaching. So I may move through some areas rather quickly, but at the bottom here, you see a link to where you can find that presentation for your future reference. Just type in that address right there. So let me start, if you're ready for me, Shane.
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, recovery is a process of change where individuals improve their health and wellness, live self-directed lives, and strive to reach their full potential. So let me just go right into it. Stage of change. So this is similar to what I've seen in coaching. There is one addition, but let me go through this. Pre-contemplation is they may not be willing, but understanding that they have a problem. So this is, they may be, and we may see clients in this stage because they are being court mandated or required by their their doctor to come see a recovery coach. So we'll see someone as soon in the pre-contemplation, hoping to move them into contemplation so they can see the possibility for change, but maybe ambivalent or uncertain of what change would look like for them. Continuing on the continuum, we're looking at preparing. So aware of the problem, but not sure what to do next. So planning. Moving into action. This is taking the steps. This is where we hold their hand and as they make those changes, followed by maintenance. This is keeping the change. And then with recovery coaching, we have this sixth step, which is the reoccurrence. So as I mentioned, relapse is a part of this disease. So, and so many times we feel like we failed when we relapse. So in the terms of this, of that, let's just go to that. Relapses can happen. It's important to avoid feelings of lost time and remorse. So what I recommend with my clients is to forgive yourself first, and then reassess your wellness plan and get back on track. Let's see if I can talk clearly. So thinking about the stages of change, if you do relapse, then you're going to go back and let me just show you that. So in step 6, you are going to go back and figure out where you were when you relapsed and hopefully pick up from there. So this is what we call recovery capital. So as you make your way through this, you're not losing time. You're just going back and learning again, if that makes sense. Continuing the process. So on top of the stages of change, we talk about stages of recovery. So stabilization. This is where early recovery, sometimes at least up to the first year, you understand what your purpose and your character is. Going into year 2, we're extending downward, inward, and forward. We're finding richness in life. Years 3 through 5 is connectedness. You join together, you see the recovery community as a whole, and you see how the world is related. And then moving into long-term recovery, in years 6 through 10, you start to become whole again. You use the automatic use of recovery tools. And then finally, in the fulfillment stage, years 10 plus, you're following through with your life purpose with gratitude and humility. And I find that some of the most beautiful people that I know are in long-term recovery. you it's a gift for many people that you speak to who are in long-term recovery, the gift of addiction, because you circle back and you find purpose in life. It is a very dedicated, and you have to dedicate a lot of energy to becoming sober or to recovering. So I just find that it's a beautiful process. 4 signs of recovery. I can address problems that they happen. I have at least one person I can be completely honest with. I have personal boundaries, and I take time to restore my energy.
Hey, Patrick.
Yeah.
So there's a question on the group chat about just explaining the kinds of recovery and what that, like what it could mean from recovering from, if it's specific substances or what that can include.
So we start with addiction. Addiction can be to any substance, a behavior, and even a process. So when we talk about recovery, we talk about it, recovery from any addiction. So many times our mind immediately goes to substance abuse, but there is also behavior, so compulsion, and also habits. So recovery is specific to that person, and we talk about being in recovery once we admit there may be a problem. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it can be very much like it can turn into like sex, food, and so those are some specific ones as well that sometimes people will substitute as well. So if they're not using their primary substance, they may turn to eating, excessively or gambling.
Absolutely. Some of us are lucky enough to have multiple addictions.
Yeah.
So that's where it gets fun.
So fun.
So fun. So talking about addiction, science has come a long way. So some of you will remember the 80s when this was what we knew about drugs. And we had Nancy Reagan telling us to just say no. So that didn't work, and more and more people got hooked on drugs. But today, we actually have brain scans of what addiction looks like. On the left-hand side, we can see a normal brain, and on the right two side, and the two on the right, we can see addiction. And I include obesity just to kind of highlight the fact that that behavior has a similar effect on the brain. And then we also know that the brain can recover. So again, on the left, we have healthy. In the middle, we have someone who has recently quit. And on the right, we see that that brain function is coming back. So the brain does have the ability to heal. Any thoughts on that before I move on?
There was a question from Ira. So can codependents who are addicted in a sense to being enablers also benefit from these principles?
Yes. We're talking about a dependency. So codependency isn't very far from it. And there are recovery groups for codependents. For example, Codependents Anonymous. But yes, I definitely see a lot of correlation between this. And I've even heard people refer to codependency as the original dependency. So learning some of that behavior in our relationships.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is the prevailing theory of addiction, is that there's a reward from the behavior. And that reward is not coping with our emotions. So we're using so that we don't have to feel in that moment. It's a relief. So we look for new ways to reward ourselves and slowly learn to process our emotions in healthy ways. So this is a slow process. And then those new habits create new neural pathways and allow the old pathways and the neurotransmitters to heal. So each chemical affects the brain differently, but this is kind of looking at all of them and synthesizing what we understand about addiction. But we really don't know what's happening with addiction yet. Unfortunately, there's no magic pill or magic treatment to cure addiction. But what we do know is that there is a very high correlation between mental health and addiction. As you can see, 50% of those experience a mental illness during their lives will also experience a substance use disorder, and vice versa. We don't know if there's one that leads to the other, but we do know that there is a very strong connection between the two. And I'm sure you see that, Shane, in your work with mental health.
Yeah, I believe I don't know if you have this in your presentation or not, but I think the number that I saw was 30% of the LGBTQ community has a co-occurring disorder, and versus like 10 to 12% of the general U.S. population. So it's like 3 times more likely to have one or both of these conditions at the same time.
Yes, very common, especially between LGBTQ. And I kind of talk about that in a minute, about that connection. As you mentioned, we call it dual diagnosis. It's also called co-occurring. And with that is trauma. So 70% of those seeking treatment for substance use disorder report at least one traumatic life event. Just a very close connection. I see trauma a lot in my work. I try to manage that. Trauma is a big part of my story, so I'm able to relate. But there's definitely times that I have to call in a therapist, or we have to look at medication to handle that. Some examples of traumatic events I have listed here, and getting to your point, I put these in alphabetical order, but it's funny how it worked out, because when we talk about LGBT, yes, there is more trauma and there's more addiction, and looking at the root being trauma, I can really see how bullying, serious illness, HIV, for example, sexual abuse, and societal trauma, which I define as society really telling you there's something wrong with you, which I'm sure some of us have felt about our sexuality. So these things can be very traumatizing and can be somewhat specific to our community. Is that kind of what you were thinking, Shane?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
So talking about trauma-informed care, trauma can terrify, overwhelm, and violate. So as caregivers, we commit to creating a sense of safety, power, and worth. Foundations are a commitment to awareness and understanding the impact of trauma and oppression. And I cover a lot here. This is for your reference. Some ideas on how to handle and how to bring trauma-informed care into your work. But again, safety, power, and worth. So that's looking at recovery. Some of the flash forward information about addiction. Were there any questions about that?
Yeah, Pete had Pete had a question. So how do you determine whether it's a healthy daily habit versus an addiction?
That's for the recovery to decide. I get into this with the recovery coaching, but this is all centered around the client, what the client perceives as a problem, or normal behavior.
Yeah. I think if I can add, it's also when it impedes functioning. So like that's often a sign on the clinical end is if when someone starts to miss work, or is in treatment repetitively, or when there's health issues and they continue to drink, so or use substances. So I think the functioning piece is really what is one of the biggest determiners is that how well are they doing in their lives? Are they able to maintain employment and income, and can they clean their house? How are their relationships? So there's this idea that like people can be functioning addicts, but I do believe that oftentimes the functioning is taken from another area of their life. So there's always a deficit somewhere, because it becomes like such a toxic relationship with that substance. So
that's a good point. Anything else?
This is Tom. I have a question.
Sure.
The comment was made that codependency is the original dependency, and that's closely associated with rewards. So my question has to do with the distinction between independence, dependence, and codependency as it pertains to what we get out of the things that make us tick, if you would. So substance abuse is clearly a codependency. So just speak more to what codependency means in terms of rewards. I'm trying to make sure I understand how that folds together.
I personally haven't dealt a lot with codependency in my work. What I do know from my personal life is there's the power, the struggle for power, and from that is resentment and manipulation. So that's all I can really speak to about that. I think maybe Shane could shed some light on that.
Yeah. So I think codependency often occurs within relationships like family and romantic for people that are in recovery or addiction, active addiction. So what will often happen is that dependence, so there's levels of healthiness. So like you want, a person or someone you have a relationship with to be independent, to be able to ask for help, but to be able to do things autonomously. And so the dependence is sort of like when you're in a relationship and, you depend on someone but there's boundaries in place. Codependency is when there's a meshment and the boundaries are poor. There's pulling and pushing. So there might be manipulation. There might be some domestic violence. There might be, like it's almost like that person, someone in the relationship or both people can't function or make decisions without the other person. And a lot of times it is connected to addiction because people in active addiction and recovery lose everything. They lose their ability to maintain relationships, their coping skills, a part of their identity. So when they have something stable, they can hang on to that, and sometimes too tightly. So it becomes really unhealthy. And an important part of, I think, recovery work in any capacity is like environmental work with the family and, making sure that that person has, and I think Patrick can confirm this too, like the person in recovery has to have like stable housing and support and their medical needs met. And so the relationship piece is important because, if there's a young man that is codependent with his parents and he can't do anything without them, he's going to have a hard time, maintaining employment or trying to move forward in his life. So.
Thank you. That explains sort of a little bit what I was assuming, which was codependency and the system that you are codependent with ultimately can force other behaviors such as a dependency on chemicals or drink or some other way to get the reward that you're missing from whatever you were codependent with. So,
because it can be like addicted to love and sex, right? So it could be addicted to those things, and that could breed codependency and addiction. So
thank you.
Yeah, one thing that came up for me when you were talking about that is it's hard to establish boundaries in a relationship where there were no boundaries. So that's a tough part of working with codependency, is how do you do that? And you're right, people in addiction do not have good boundaries. So I talk about that a little bit more. Let me get to that. So recovery coaching is anyone interested in promoting recovery by removing barriers and obstacles to recovery and serving as a personal guide and mentor for people seeking or in recovery. So let's start with the scale of the problem to really, and sorry for my Canadian friends, this is the US. So this is what we as Americans spend on drugs. That's a lot of money. It comes up to $276 billion out of our pockets to support this. And I talk about alcohol. It's binge alcohol or heavy drinking. This isn't what we call normal consumption, a couple glasses of wine with dinner. This is heavy. Heavy drinking is something like more than 15 drinks in a week, and binge is more than 5 drinks in one setting. So, and just to kind of give you a reference point, for a daily meth user, you're looking at about, if you were to consume about 1 gram per day, you're talking about $30,000 per year that you're spending on your drug choice. So that's a lot of money. And that equates into the Americans and our government and our corporations, what we're spending. We'll start with the 276 from before, what we're spending, and then we look at the larger picture of all the money that's spent on drug and addiction, and that number, drum roll, comes up to $1 trillion every year going to fight this problem. So, okay, as a business person, I'm looking at this thing, that's a lot of money. There's a lot of money being spent on this. Probably not the best way of looking at it. So let's look at the efficacy of recovery coaching. So it is a rather new field, but data is already supporting how effective it is in helping people with recovery. So a couple highlighted ones is less criminal justice involvement, increased treatment, retention, and reduced substance use. So all of these things point to why this is a good methodology and a good reason to spend money on recovery coaching. But what is a recovery coach? Well, the coach fills a vital role in the recovery process because we walk with the client as they make choices to build their recovery. So we're your partner. And we understand that there's multiple pathways to recovery. And I list them out here just to emphasize that we've established a lot of ways to get sober. I'll kind of zoom in here just to kind of get your fire your neurons to really think about what you're doing or what one of your clients could do to improve their recovery. I do have a link here at the bottom if you want to download this for your reference. I do have a JPEG of all of these pathways to recovery. Any thoughts before I move on? Moving on then. So with recovery coaching, it can sometimes be very slow in the beginning. And we're going back to, we're talking about people who are just really contemplating the gravity of their problem. And I mentioned this can be a discouraging or challenging part of the coaching process. So, and sometimes we're just addressing one problem, and we're addressing a problem with someone who doesn't really want to change. So if the court is telling them they have to see a recovery coach, as a coach, we have our work cut out for us. Comparing this to my typical life coaching client who comes to me ready, is paying money to get the changes that they want. So it's definitely a different dynamic. And what we do is we help recoveries make choices about their recovery and then help them create a wellness plan. So the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, this is the spine of what we do. So you can see here where we are in relationship to what the recovery is doing to build their recovery. We're helping them make choices, and we're letting them make the choices though. Creating your own plan empowers, motivates, and creates a clear vision for what you want and what recovery means for you. So there is some confusion though about where a coach fits in this. So a counselor definitely has formal knowledge, formal training. A sponsor has experience, and a coach will typically have experience and training. Style of help, formal and specialized. You'll see a therapist who has, CBT or a specific technique that they use. A coach, this will be completely driven by the client. And then a sponsor, it's going to be specific to the program. For example, AA has a very specific way that sponsors should help people in recovery. Power differential, we have a minimal differential similar to sponsors. Supervision, counselors have a lot of paperwork and a lot of reporting that they have to do. Coaches have none to minimum, it's growing, and sponsors, of course, have no supervision. Counselors primarily looking at the past, coaches looking at the present, and then a sponsor is going to do a combination of looking at the past and looking at the present. And then documentation. Again, counselors have to document a lot of their work. Coaches have minimal, if not none. And sponsors, of course, have no documentation. So coaches, you know this, we focus on the here and now, the present. Although the past can influence the present, it cannot be changed. We understand our past, but we're not prisoner to it. So, no opinions. This is important. Clients drive their recovery. So we can impose our views on what recovery should look like for our client or what recovery looked like for us. We have to let them be responsible for the choices they make and really decide what recovery looks like for them. It's going back, there's a lot of pathways to recovery. This will be just comment on this. With sponsorship, for example, your sponsor knows exactly what works, what's been, what was written and what worked for them and what their sponsor taught them. So I run into sponsors who a lot of times bump heads with them because they're very clear on what would work. And I, coming from AA, I understand that. But as a coach, I have to step back and let the process, let the recovery figure out what that process looks like for them. So this is going to maybe push some of our buttons. Recovery coaches are encouraged to share your story. Similar to sponsors, this helps you connect, shows empathy, illustrates a point. But here are some guidelines that we use for self-disclosure. I'm going to read it briefly. Keep the story brief and have a purpose. Share in real time based on what's being discussed. Be aware that your share can trigger the recovery. They should serve the recovery, not the coach. And always go with your gut. So when in doubt, leave it out. And do not use shares as a way to shortcut what the recovery's discovery process is. So Shane, do you have any thoughts about self-disclosure?
You know, it's, yeah, I mean, it's a very similar line. I think that it's, you know, there's always that possibility for a transference, which is, or counter-transference as well, when you're sort of over connecting or oversharing or you know, or blurring the lines of the relationship. So so I think it is important to think about what the benefit could be for the client or the person sitting in front of you. So it should be on their best interest. I think we learn from first person experience, and you know, and so when we can connect with people in that way. But I think it has to be really purposeful, clear, and if you do share something about yourself, it has to be very relevant to what's going on in that moment. So, you know, so if there is, if you feel like it could be something really positive and beneficial based on the client's needs, then it definitely could be beneficial. But you have to think about, you know, is it going to cross the boundary? Is it going to negatively impact the client? So if they have trauma or poor boundaries or have like some pretty severe mental health issues, or, you know, or maybe have some manipulative behavior, it probably would be something I would think about, you know, sharing minimal information. But it's very individualized as well. So
yeah. I know many counselors who are very against self-disclosing or sharing personal stories, and as well as some coaches. So I guess everybody has their own technique.
Yeah, I think it's been helpful for me at times, but I have to be, like, I've learned how to be very sort of cognizant of when, why, and how, you know, like using my senses to be able to, like, to know what's appropriate and what's not.
All right, I'm going to keep moving because it looks like time is flying by. You mentioned boundaries. So boundaries with people in addiction can be particularly difficult because we do have a close connection with the recovery. And as I mentioned, people in active addiction typically don't have boundaries. So let's compare the two because it is a very close relationship. Let's first look at friends. Friends loan you money, crash on your couch, meet you for dinner, hire you for odd jobs, and take your calls at all hours of the night. And we do have a friendship with our clients. So the difference would be listening, giving advice, taking a walk in the park, pick you up from treatment. Coaches are encouraged to get out and meet their recovery, especially if they're changing facilities or just getting out of treatment. We want to make sure that we get them to the right place. It can be very blurry what those lines look like. So let's always remember that friends is a reciprocal relationship, and a friendship or a coach is unidirectional. So some tips: establish rules in the first meeting and have them agree to it. Immediately address violations. This one's important for me. To clarify with myself why that boundary is important. So understanding why it's important helps me keep that. Most important rule, in my opinion, is the fourth one. Don't try to control the recovery's use. This is dealing in your personal life, in your professional life. We can't control how people use, how often they use, how much. This is a decision that they're making. We just have to create boundaries for ourselves. And with recovery coaching, you often will have a supervisor. So it's always a good place to go if you have questions about that. Active listening. This is all as coaches. We do a lot of active listening, but similarly, focus your attention on the client. Follow along as if you were walking in their shoes. So experience it with them. Sit closely and avoid distractions. Listen with all your senses. Let the argument run its course. And set aside your prejudice and opinions. Reflective listening, questioning, clarifying, or parroting. This is important. Use the recovery's language. So as we're repeating what they say, we may go into jargon or use clinical terms. This does not help the situation. It does not tell the recovery that you understand what they're going through or that you understand what they're saying. If there's a question about what they're saying, ask them to clarify what that word means and then begin using it. Validate their emotion. Encourage more sharing. Whenever you ask questions, you're showing that you're interested. Take your time and summarize. I'm going to fly through that because you guys understand that. Some of the techniques with recovery coaching, I mentioned the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. Creating the action plan. The wellness areas, there's typically 8 areas that we look at, and we'll create an action, a focus, a goal in each one of these areas. I typically ask my clients, what's your overall recovery wellness goal? Or what does a happy life in recovery look like? They usually have a very clear idea of what they want their life to be. And this helps ground them in what they want and the change that they want. Some tips. Okay, if you're working with someone who's early in recovery, you're going to be motivated to say, okay, change this and get healthy and go to meetings and see a psychiatrist. You're going to be really motivated to make a big step in their life, but they're not necessarily going to be that motivated. So focus on one thing at a time. And usually whatever is the biggest crisis, I'll see housing or getting into treatment. So do one thing at a time and let that momentum grow. The recovery should also write, maintain, and keep their plan with them and bring it with them every day. So here's an example. I have these printed out. Depending on what they're working on, I just help them create it right there in front of me. Working with people in recovery, early recovery is important that they have something physically that they can look at, because the drugs' impact on the brain is sometimes they lose ability to understand things orally or conceptually, but visual comprehension remains throughout the addiction process. So being able to see something, I know I didn't say it the best way, but being able to see it helps a lot. So in this case, they're looking at their spirituality. And these are some of the questions that I would ask around that to help them complete this. I'd love to go through them all, but it looks like we're running short on time. So the main thing, besides the wellness recovery plan, another technique we use, and we borrow this from counseling, is motivational interviewing. So you'll see a lot of times people coming in and they're not motivated to change. And, you know, going back to Nancy Reagan, if we could tell someone not to do something and it worked, then, I mean, there would be no addiction. That just doesn't happen. So we ask questions to motivate people to the change. These are the 5 principles. Express empathy, develop discrepancy, avoid arguments, adjust to their resistance, and support self-efficacy. So I put this here. This is the form that we would complete as they're making that decision to change. And this really encompasses the 5 principles. 1, expressing empathy. You're asking them, and then we're putting on paper what they're saying. They understand that they're being understood, and they're expressing themselves. With discrepancy, they're actually creating for themselves the advantages and the disadvantages of change or no change. So they're creating the argument themselves. Let me keep on flying through this. Some techniques, we talked about these 4, of course, open-ended questions. And these are 2 other techniques that I find very effective, is side with the negative. So if they're coming to you and they're like, you know, they don't really want to change, well, go with that. So like, for example, from what you said, it sounds like quitting would be just too hard for you. So of course they're going to be like, no, I survived these streets. I, you know, survived trauma. I can do this. So, and the other thing I will do is I will emphasize the argument that they're making. So go with them, but over the top. That can create the discrepancy for them. And these are the kind of statements that we're looking for is, you know, I guess this is more serious than I thought. I know that if I try, I can really do it. And the number 1 rule with motivational interviewing is bring spirit. And for me, this means bringing the spirit of everyone who's ever been kind to me. Everyone that helped me get here today, helped me get sober, I come to the room with that. And also for me means my higher power. So I come bringing all of this power into the meeting. The experts in motivational interview define spirit as this: collaboration, evoking, autonomy, and compassion. Collaboration of service. I'm going to just fly through the rest of this. As a coach, we help clients put their life back together. So we, in each one of those areas, we start to build a buffer around them. And we call this a recovery capital. So this keeps us in our recovery, and it's just a toolbox of things that can help us keep sober. And sometimes we have to ask for help. And almost through, I'm going to show people how to become a recovery coach. So there are state boards in over 45 states, and I do see some, it looks like the UK has one as well. These are going to be considered the areas that you're going to are. Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery is kind of the leader in the field. There are a lot of agencies that are credentialing. These are the ones that are highly recommended and used by most of these states. Let me just show you quickly what one state, in this case New York State, what their requirements are. So recovery coaches, the agency, this is a state organization. These are the hours that are the classes that are required. And these are some of the typical experience requirements. Many states want you to have personal experience with recovery. This certification allows you to bill an agency, the client, or family. And then if you have 500 hours of supervision, you can then begin billing Medicaid. So insurance reimbursement. Okay, working with Medicaid is a frustrating process. They do have uniform pricing though, and that's, instead of New York, $78 an hour. But to bill, you have to have a relationship with a state-approved facility. So this is a slow-moving process. You can either be employed by the agency or have a relationship with them so that they're billing for you and they're giving you a part of that $78. So $78 gets kind of, when you consider paying the facility, paying for your office, it really isn't a lot of money. Private insurance is coming along because providers are demanding it. There will be some confusion though, because approval will depend greatly between insurance companies, what one approves and what doesn't approve. New York State has 3 specialties: the standard recovery coach, you can be recovery family, and we do have youth coming as well. Some coaches also distinguish themselves by niche. I work a lot with people in business. Sober companion. The most recent example of this is Wendy Williams, very public battle with cocaine addiction. She was living in a sober house and she had a sober companion who basically followed her around to keep her, out of trouble. And then there are also people who specify in a particular addiction. So, and I include on here food, because some coaches, like wellness coaches, you may actually be working with recovery and not realizing the similarity. All right. I just have one thing I want to add. We are looking for people, coaches like yourself, to be thought leaders in this industry. It is a new industry. We're leaning heavily on therapists and counselors to develop our techniques. We're also looking for coaches to build this body of knowledge. So if any of you would like to help on that, I can speak on the entire recovery. I can speak on behalf of the entire recovery community to say that we would really appreciate your support.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I'm delighted to have been on this call, Patrick, and I hope that you are talked into doing something about this at the conference, because it is a new field in the same way that coach supervision is relatively new, and we like to learn as much as we can. And life coaching is not suitable for anyone in early recovery. That's my view. And so to have this as a possibility is really filling a valuable niche, I should say. And yeah, and I'm glad to see it certified and all those kind of things. So I really want to thank you for putting this all together. Good, thank you very much. And we're going to be here in October. I can't remember the date, the second Thursday of October. And we have a very interesting discussion going on with Gary Schleifer about his newly developed thoughts and workshop about using time. So is he here? Is he still here?
I am, and it's the Free Time Boot Camp for Entrepreneurs, breaking yourself free of the 24/7 business rut.
There it goes. So be on the call, and thank you for everybody for being here.